So, Andrew Morgan, who has had an enormous influence on my life through his teaching at SEDBA when I was in Cairo, the history class. It's a great pleasure and honour to be interviewing you, Andrew, for our family archives. So, if I may share my ignorance, but also fill in the background of your life. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Aberystwyth in 1924.
And I know that you know a great deal about your family because you're just handing over a monumental work on the history of your family. How would you characterise the family from which you are descended?
Peasant.
Peasant? You know I disapprove of the word peasant.
That's why I said it.
Yes,
No. Small Welsh hill farming background of a non-conformist nature in early 19th century with a younger son with brains who was sent into the Church of Wales and became parson, and then Morgans have been professional ever since.
So it was by that time a professional family. Your father was?
My father was a headmaster.
A headmaster.
Yes. Of a county grammar school, one of the old voluntary aided.
Which one was that?
The Judd School in Tunbridge.
That's interesting because I've just been to the reunion with my DPhil supervisor, and one of the points that's always made about him was that he was a Welsh farming family background.
Yes.
Ended up as president of the British Academy and master of Corpus College, Oxford, Sir Keith Thomas. And,
Oh yes, yes.
And he was one of about 4 famous historians who went to Barry Grammar School. And so you're another one who mentioned the Welsh.
And oddly, I've been corresponding in recent months with Keith Thomas about Colin Matthew.
Ah, yes, well, he was a friend of his, then, of course. So you automatically went to a grammar school?
No. My father fell out with the Cardiganshire Education Authority, where he's headmaster in Aberystwyth, because they had a lockout. The authority locked the teachers out, uniquely, I think, in educational history. So my father decided to move to Kent and got this good job there, but partly because he did not believe in having his own children in his own school. And in the same town of Tunbridge there was Sir Andrew Judd's old school, which is now known as Tunbridge School, which had very advantageous terms for day boys. So I was very lucky indeed to get a public school education with all its idiosyncrasies and disadvantages, and the challenge of becoming a rebel there. And like E.M. Forster, who was also an old boy, hating parts of it, but having a damn good education and getting a lot of financial help from the profits of such people as Sir Andrew Judd, who had been in the Muscovy trade in the 16th century, and Sir Thomas Smythe, first president of the East India Company, first chairman, whose ill-gained profits helped me through Oxford.
So, were you already at school interested in history? Or?
Oh yes, yes. Oh, before I even went to school, I remember borrowing my father's books, saying, "Can I have a look at that one, Daddy?" and trying to make notes of it.
Is there any particular thing that you think led you towards an interest in history as a child? Or
I think possibly 2 things. One, physical idleness, that I could do this sitting at a table and desk and didn't have to be rushing around being active. And second, as the youngest of 5 children, all very competitive, I was left with the problem of identifying and capturing an area of knowledge which had not been monopolized by one of my older brothers already. So the competition of being the youngest forced me into areas of interest just to be able to say, to be able to cock a couple of fingers at them.
And you said that at school you were training to be a rebel. You've always
I hope so.
I mean, that's what I remember about you at Sedbergh. You stood out. I remember there was one schoolmaster at the Dragon School who was a member of the Communist Party, and this was a very right-wing sort of school, and but he was also a wonderful teacher, so they allowed him to be a member. And then you at Sedbergh always stood out as a socialist and supporter of the Labour Party in that school, which was mainly conservative. So you've always been a rebel.
I hope I am sufficiently sceptical always to be questioning every assumption. I don't live up to it, but it's a good thing to aim at, I think. And apropos of what you were saying about Sedbergh, I remember being slightly surprised at the end of my first year by being told, by roundabout ways, that this young man Morgan's a communist and he's teaching these History 6 chaps most heretical stuff. So the next year I deliberately tried, when I was teaching the Reformation, to take a strongly Roman Catholic interpretation of it, in the hopes that it would come back to me that I was a papist. Alas, this didn't happen.
That's difficult. When you went to Oxford, you went to read history. In what year was this?
45, 46.
Oh, you'd already served in...
Yes, I went straight from school to the Navy and then came back.
Well, tell me a little bit about your time in the Navy. Where were you serving? Because I gather you got a decoration.
I served as an ordinary seaman in a cruiser in the Arctic and in the Bare Biscay on anti-aircraft duties. As an officer, I served for a little while on a Canadian corvette on Atlantic convoys in midwinter. And then I did my submarine training and joined the famous 10th Flotilla, which had been in Malta, but by that time was in Madeleine on the south of France landings. And then I moved as spare crew out to Trincomalee and was lucky enough to get a place as 5th officer in a newly arrived S-class boat called Shakespeare. And I did my one and only patrol in her, and we were lucky to survive.
What medal did you get?
A thing called DSC.
DSC.
Yes.
Do you think that wartime experience had a lot of influence on your later life?
Yes, I can't identify precisely what, but I'm sure it must have done.
It didn't make the rest of life seem rather pale and...
Oh no. No. I'm beginning to identify one or two influences as you speak. I think one of the things I remember most vividly was, I suppose it must have been after the end of hostilities when we were on our way home and there was no danger and all the rest of it, and we could chat on the bridge with the lookouts and the officer on watch with a couple of lookouts and other people up on the bridge, and you were right in the middle of the ocean with nothing to do and nothing to go wrong. And I remember vividly long conversations with one lad who'd been born in a brothel in Dover, and he was, I thought, endowed with a native intelligence that thrilled me. But equally I was appalled by what the society had allowed him to do with his brain. May I not develop it at all. The educational system had deprived him of the chances of development. And I think if I ever had any ambition coming out of that war, it was to give to such people the sort of chances and advantages that I'd had. Well, I didn't start my teaching career exactly along those lines, but I was getting increasingly unhappy in spending my life at Sedbergh teaching those whose parents could afford the benefit of my education. And thank God I managed to find a niche in the county department, county sector, as head of a grammar school, which then had the opportunity to go comprehensive, and we did, successfully, I believe.
Good, well we'll come on to that. Returning to Oxford, what did it feel like going to Oxford in 1946?
A wonderful focusing on something purposeful, because wartime activity had been so desultory and so intense at one moment, but so flatulent, misdirected, pointless for 9/10 of the time. And to be ground into sharp focus on day one and given something to be pursuing was absolutely thrilling. It was very demanding, because the mind hadn't been used very much for about 3 years. That was, I think, the first thing, the sense of, at last, getting on with doing something I really wanted to be doing and found intrinsically interesting.
You came in 46, did you?
I think January 46 I went up.
Which was about half a year before I arrived as a 6 or 5-year-old boy to Oxford, to the coldest winter that...
Of course.
And I was living in the Boundary Road, and there you were at the university. Our paths hadn't quite crossed then, but anyway. Behind me, I think T. Lawrence was writing the 7 Pillars of Wisdom or something, and all sorts of things were happening one wasn't quite aware of. Who taught you mainly at Oxford?
Oh, John Prestwich,
yes.
Who is still alive, I think, in his 90s.
Is he? The son I knew, John Michael.
Of course. John Prestwich was, dare I say it, an abominably bad lecturer. He was a scholar who fell far short of what he himself had hoped to be, because he never really got round to writing the great works. But as a tutor, he was, this was the greatest thing I had at Oxford. It wasn't friendships, though they were great too. But most people say, what do you get out of Oxford? And it's the friends you make. Not with me. It was the meeting of minds, and not the history he taught me, but the wonderful way in which handling my essays in tutorials, by taking up the points one made and the way in which he conducted things, it just sharpened the mind, as you can see, into an absolute chaos.
And gave you a sense of humour as well, I expect. Yes, I mean, he had a formidable son and also a formidable wife, who I knew.
Menna was also my tutor, and she was superb.
Yes, I knew her.
Charles Stewart at Christchurch was also a tutor of mine at one stage, but he was at Queen's temporarily then, before he went to Christchurch. He became Collins' tutor at Christchurch too. And also, yes, most memorably, contemporary of mine, Edmund Dell, who came back as an ex-warrior, took his finals a year before I did, and then became, for a short while, a tutor at Queen's, and he tutored me in my last year. And that old bear of a man, who died only recently in his wonderful book on the Chancellors, I think is one of the greatest pieces of contemporary history. He was a great tutor, but alas, Queen's didn't care for him. He lacked the soft touch with those who hadn't quite got the sort of pugnacious response that I was giving him. You had to be very robust to stand up to Edmund. But if you could, he was a damn good tutor.
One feature of that education, which later came to influence me a lot, and you've written to me about it, but it'd be nice to have it on film as well, was that I had to relearn the continuity of British history, that the revolution, which by the 60s was being taught in Oxford, that there had been a great cataclysmic break in the time of the Reformation or just before. This idea, which comes in partly from German sociologists like Marx and Weber. When we corresponded, you said, but I never had to unlearn that because I've never learnt that. Do you remember, I mean, you did the whole of English history, didn't you, as an undergraduate?
Oh, yes.
And did you have a sense that there was no moment when you could say the world has totally changed from a medieval world to a modern world?
I think it became an indivisible continuum pretty soon after I started studying history at Oxford. And of course, as one went further on and on, the sense of continuousness just took over from all previous concepts of division. And whilst it was still necessary to use such terms as Tudor and Stuart for the sake of quick reference, signposts, and it was obviously desirable to have more apt terms such as early modern and modern, there was no clear moment when early modern started, ever.
Well, the fact that John Prestwich was a medievalist, wasn't he?
Yes.
And then there was this great group of medievalists like Carl Leiser, K.B. Macfarlane, and their pupils later who taught me, like James Campbell. And they all taught medieval history as this a gradual transition between Anglo-Saxon and modern. So you were obviously very deeply influenced by that. And it was
Indeed, and such people as Kosminski, I think.
Oh, yes.
I remember the deep impact some of his articles made on me, teaching that the feudal system, in terms of the relation between the landholder and the serf, had very largely broken down by, the 13th century? And the substitution of wage labour for serf labour had occurred very widespread in England long before the end of the so-called Middle Ages. Is my memory right?
That's right, and bastard feudalism.
That's it. And is Kosminski still regarded as being acceptable?
Oh yes, it's never been replaced. In fact, I was wondering, by the time I got to Oxford, a lot of it had been forgotten, and one of the things that always puzzles me is that they just stopped teaching Stubbs's historical documents by the time I got there, and Maitland was never mentioned to me as an undergraduate. But was he mentioned to you?
I mentioned Edmund Dell a moment ago. I remember having a conversation with Edmund in hall one evening, I think shortly before he took his own finals. He said, "We've got too much to read. Let's just play a game and devise a reading list where you have one major work which is going to supply you with all you need to know to answer such and such paper. English medieval history, English middle history, English modern history, your European period. Well, what are you going to choose as your book?" And Edmund's own answer was Maitland.
I've just given the Maitland Memorial Lecture at Downing College as part of their bicentenary celebrations, and it's the first time I went to see his portrait in Downing and met all the leading Maitland experts in Cambridge and so on. And I'm just at the moment trying to find a publisher for a book which is about Maitland. Half of the book is about Maitland. I think the argument of my lecture was that he is not just the greatest of British historians, but he's also one of the greatest political economists of modern times, on the same stature as Tocqueville and people like that. So, but there was no mention, strangely. I mean, I may have forgotten, but he said he didn't have much impact, and I didn't read any Maitland until Geoffrey Elton, in fact, who wrote a book about him and was very keen on him.
Yes.
Geoffrey Elton, and also Peter Stein, who is the professor of civil history here, both of them said I should read some Maitland, and I did, and changed my life. Anyway, you went down. What degree did you get? Do you remember? Or?
I got a second. I thought, to the consternation of Bruce Lockett, who was head of SEDBA, who had already given me a job before I'd taken my finals. And my name actually did not appear recognizably in the published lists. And I thought that my future headmaster would, in July, before I took up my first appointment, obviously be studying the list to see what sort of a degree his new appointment had got. Not a bit of it, actually. He was away fishing in the Highlands and didn't care a damn. But it derived, the misunderstanding derived from this curious anomaly that my surname is Morgan, but I'd been known as Lloyd Morgan for quite a part of my life, largely because my father in Wales needed the suffix to distinguish him from other Morgans. When he went to England, of course, he didn't need it at all, but he still remained Lloyd Morgan. I think some of my cousins have even been known to hyphenate it. But when I took our job in England and was in control of my own self-terminology, I gave up the Lloyd, certainly when I went to SEDBA, because it wasn't needed in England. But at Oxford, I hadn't been entered there by me. No, my parents had entered me. So I was known to college as Lloyd Morgan. But to the examiners and the publishers of schools' results, I appeared as A.M. Lloyd.
Bruce Lockett, if he hadn't been fishing, would have been
he should have been concerned.
So you went to SEDBA in
48.
48?
Yes.
What sort of school did you find it in 48? This is probably school archive in case it aired out.
Wildly exciting.
You're not being ironic.
No, I loved the atmosphere. I didn't know it at the time, but basically I'm not a city man. I'm not even a town man. I'm a small town man or a village man. And the setting, the social setting of this was good for me. I liked a lot of colleagues straight off. I thought Bruce Lockett was an inspiring man to work under. I found that even John Coldham, the housemaster under whom I worked, who was Hart House,
yes.
high Anglican and high Tory with an extremely prejudiced wife and blinkered, as so many of the SEDBA staff were. Yes. Nevertheless, were the sort of people I'd been brought up with. I knew their language. I could talk with them. And it was only gradually, increasingly over the years that I came to feel suffocated by their blinkered outlook on life and their unwillingness to acknowledge or even face the sort of changes that were overcoming Britain and damn well needed to be faced. So.
You really enjoyed it?
Oh, I loved it. And of course, having the run of Clio. It scared me stiff.
Clio, of course, is a sixth form history class, I'm just saying this for the record. Did you start teaching that straight away?
Yes.
Gosh.
That was the job I was given to. I think I shared a little of the history with Monty Christopherson. I think he did a little of it, but otherwise, the higher certificate year and the scholarship group, both years within Clio were my responsibility, and about half my teaching time was allocated to Clio. Well, a lovely job. And of course, the teaching took place in the library.
Did it?
Yes.
Before it was renewed?
Before it was renewed. This was a blessed place to teach because the
16th century, 17th century library?
The 17th century, I think, yes. and these velvet-covered banks of benches where the chaps would just come in and put their feet up on the table and loll back and hope that they were going to be educated this way. It was a delightful atmosphere for getting debates going and arguing with people. I found myself teaching stuff that I didn't know at all well in substance, so I quickly got into the habit of saying to them, well, I'm not here to teach you. I'm only here to provoke you. You've got the responsibility of learning what the textbook says. That's not my job. So that was a lovely cop-out, but of course it was an absolute scandal that we monopolized the library because the rest of the school couldn't use it during school hours. So when the Bracken bequest came into the air and he wanted to refurbish the library, I quickly put in a state paper to the bursar and to the headmaster saying, Clio must get out. There are 2 cottages just come onto the market. Opposite the library, next to Lupton House. If the school can afford to convert those into a classroom for Clio, we've still got access to this superb resource. It's got one of the best history libraries of any school. And the History 6 must have access to that. So regrettably, I'm not wanting to bring Clio up to the classrooms with the rest of the block, with the rest of the school. And the authorities fell for this suggestion, converted those cottages into a ghastly little sort of factory place.
Yes, it was right.
But it was ideally situated.
It was ideally situated in various respects. One was that it was, for me, when I was in Lupton House, I could walk it to my classroom in 10 seconds. The only respect in which it wasn't ideal was that every May, was it, they used to decide to dig up the road with pneumatic drills outside the fire, back and forth.
Yeah, of course, yes.
As they do in some Cambridge streets just before finals. But anyway, otherwise it was great. Now you had, you've told us, or this may not interest you terribly, but I know that you had a number of very interesting students. I mean, there were many interesting ones who've done other interesting things, but when you had your reunion in the House of Commons, a number of people there who were easiest for me to remember. And I was just going to ask you whether you wanted to comment on any of them. For example, Peter Adaman, who started the Jorvik Centre. You presumably remember him as an undergrad, as a student.
Oh yes, yes. He was a self-taught genius in his archaeology. He was digging a village, a lost village that he and Gavin Simpson had discovered. When they were in the 6th form, they'd written off to Professor Beresford, who came along and said, yes, dear boy, you found a good village here. And this was the start of his career. Oh, yes.
And then the Lord Chief Justice?
Who is now been promoted to Chief Lord of Appeal.
Has he?
Yes. Oh, yes. He was, I thought, the only pupil I've ever come across, in my arrogant way, about whom I felt I could not teach him anymore.
Really?
And that
At what point?
well, he went up to try for a Balliol Award the first time, and they didn't give him anything.
Remind me of his name. Because
Tom Bingham.
That's right.
Yes.
Lord Bingham. That's right.
They liked him. They liked him, but he had to stay on school for another 6 months or whatever it was before Balliol came up again. And thank goodness they saw fit to give him something the next time round. Otherwise there would have been a lot of blushing somewhere. But he was obviously the ablest, best. He had the best brain of any that I've ever come across. I think Colin
Matthew,
Matthew was probably,
who became professor at Oxford.
that's it, and the great, great Gladstone scholar.
Yes, yes.
He was probably the best scholar. And undoubtedly, you were the best in the sense of being intellectually the most adventurous.
That's very sweet of you.
I don't know whether the distinction between the best brain, the best scholar, intellectually the most adventurous is a valid distinction or one that means anything to others. It certainly means something to me. Three very specialized peculiarities of mental abilities.
Yes, well, since I treasure imagination and adventurousness, in fact, I had a PhD student yesterday. I asked him why he'd switched from the expert in his field. He said, well, because you had such curious ideas.
Yes, well, that's the excitement of it, yes.
So, and another who would be very nice if you just take whatever you liked about him is my uncle, Robert Rhodes James.
Oh, dear Robert, yes. Robert was the wildest and the most unteachable.
Strange that he should end up as a Conservative MP, but...
Yes, a lovely fellow. And he was, when I first met him, I think at, what was it called then? Not O-level, but the one before that. He was so deeply embedded in his own view of history that the only thing he could see at Trafalgar was Nelson's heroic death. The strategic importance of the battle escaped him. And my difficulty with Robert was always to get him to look deeper into the significance of the events he knew a hell of a lot about and loved. And my God, he could write excitingly about. But I felt I failed with Robert in that whilst he did, I think, a damn good job on Rosebery and a very exciting first book on Randolph Churchill and one or two others, which Gallipoli I think was good. I felt increasingly that he'd slipped back into the old habits of a degree of superficiality. And I think it was partly because he was a lost soul between two worlds of parliamentary ambition and scholarly ambition. And he didn't do justice to himself. And one book I thought in particular, that was the Anthony Eden biography, showed almost visible signs of where he had had to drop his pen and rush off to a division bell. The work didn't hang together.
Well, I think you, as a nephew who was very closely associated with him in my childhood, because he was my older brother, so to speak, and he was caught not only between two ambitions and didn't manage to integrate them, but he was also caught, I think, between two eras. In a funny way, as was said at his memorial service, and many people have commented, he seemed to be a person out of his age. He seemed to be someone who was really at home in the late 19th century in the politics of the 19th century. And that's why he wrote very well about that period.
Yes.
But the contemporary world, he didn't seem to be completely integrated.
No.
And he was a very dreamy child, I know. And I've seen his notebooks, and he lived. I now, since I'm interested in eyesight, I think the fact that he was almost blind.
Yes.
Blind in one eye and not very good with the other eye. He lived a very intern. He was a very myopic personality in many ways. And talking to his widow, Angela, I mean, she sort of confirmed it in various ways, that he found it very difficult to relate to other people. I mean, he had lots of friends, and he was a warm person, but he was a sort of shy, and sometimes even with her, she said she just didn't know what he was thinking. He would take decisions without consulting her and so on. So there was, and what's sad about it is that he was just on the edge of being a really great man.
Yes.
And wasn't in the end, probably. Who knows? The other person another person I remember in there was Christopher Bland, who's the head of the BBC. I knew all the Blands, I knew some of the younger Blands too. They were all at Lupton House, Catholic, I think. What was Christopher like? He's quite an obeying character now.
He was his own man right from the start. I never knew him.
Yeah, he's like that now. He's a politician through and through.
Yes. Very able, very ambitious. Was highly skeptical of criticism at times. He wanted to know more about why, which is a damn good thing. It's obviously got something to do with the man's genius. But as a person, he was one of the ones who was close to me in the sense of the teaching relationship was very close, but in personal terms, I didn't know the man at all.
Was there anyone else who you taught who you wanted to mention?
Oh yes, I only taught him for one term, and he then went off to Cambridge, and that was John Arden. He was in Clio when I arrived, and he was head of Hart House. And that astonishing high Tory figure, John Colton, had, bless him, had the nerve to make the rebellious, radical, idiosyncratic John Arden head of Hart House, a school prefect. John Arden's production of Hamlet that December was an event in its own right. He did the whole thing, produced it and acted it. Now, John Arden, as you know, later moved over into sympathy with Irish Republican history and the whole movement. And I thought, when Robert and I were talking about who should be invited to this, I could not omit mentioning John Arden, but I did have to admit to myself that I mustn't push it too hard, because John Arden's Republican loyalties by that time would clearly be an embarrassment to Robert and Charles Shaw and other Tory figures, establishment figures. So I did the decent thing of saying John Arden should be mentioned, but I won't push it hard. Robert, with urbane excellence, such as only the English Tory can exercise, said, no, not John Arden. He's gone a bit dotty.
Just the last thing on Clio. So impossible question really, but you, I know the Lord Chief Justice, when he gave the little talk, he tried to characterise what effect you'd had on him, which was you opened, I mean he didn't put it in these Keatsian phrases, but you'd open magic casements on fairyland for all. You'd open new vistas, things, prospects which he'd never thought of, and enchanted him and amused him and interested him in a way that had never happened before, and I think you did the same for all of us. That's how we perceived it, but you excited us for really the first time in history. I mean, I still remember my first essay for you, which was on the Renaissance, and I don't know, I must have cribbed it from a very good book, because it was the best mark you ever gave me, alpha minus, and you said, you know, this is university level, this is fantastic, and I went down all the way from there, but it really gave me enormous confidence that you liked it so much, and I was thrilled, and I learned an enormous amount from you. Looked at from the other end, how would you characterise your philosophy of teaching history at that time?
At that time? I've never been a philosopher. Let me answer your question by telling you a story of what happened at De Aston, the school I went to after Sedbergh, when the school was inspected. Actually, it was the second inspection the school had, some 18 years after I'd been there. I asked for both inspections. I asked for the first inspection on the grounds that I wanted all that was wrong with the school to be blamed on my predecessor. And it would give me a program of what to do about the school. Excellent. And then, 18 years later, I asked for another inspection, partly to help my successor, because I knew I was going to be moving out, to give him a sort of shopping list of things that needed to be done. By that time, the school's inspectors were required by law to start their report by having a statement of what the school's philosophy was, on the headmaster's strategy and aims and objectives. Right. And the chief inspector came into my study one day and said, well, what is your sort of philosophy of education? I said, anyone who says he's got a philosophy of education is a charlatan. It's just a question of getting on and doing what you believe in. As soon as you become self-conscious and analytical about what you're doing, the spirit goes. It goes dead. You are in teaching because there are certain things you enjoy and you want to communicate to others, and you trust your staff, you appoint the staff who've got similar enthusiasms, and you say, get on with it, do your own thing. Now, okay, I'm exaggerating terribly, but I have been frightened stiff all my life of trying to be dogmatic in answering the question, what is your philosophy? Because I think it kills the spirit. And I find myself going terribly pompous when I do that. And that is not the way. It's the relationship, it's the communication. And if that goes dead, you might as well get out of the classroom. Now, I know that's no answer at all.
It isn't. It's a very good answer. But I suppose what I was wondering, I mean, one only selectively remembers certain things. I remember one of your techniques was to size up all of us and suggest that we read a book which would correct a bias in our character. I mean, what I thought you might say is that you've learned from Prestwich and Oxford and from your rebellious nature to be counter-suggestible, that you would, whatever view the student takes, which is how we educate our students now, you try and put the opposite point of view to get them to argue and think.
Yes.
And you also applied this to their character, because you would set us a book to read for our summers. And the book that you set us actually indicated a lot about what you thought we were like. So I've always been amused that you set me, you won't remember, but you set me Norman Douglas's South Wind.
Did I really?
And of course I loved it.
Yes.
And it was full of the warm south, the blissful hippocrene with beaded bubbles winking at the rim, vaguely homoerotic, which I didn't know at the time, and full of the relaxation of a non-Puritan world. Here I was at this Puritan northern boarding school, very serious little boy, and suddenly to be open to this warm world was just right. Good.
I must have thought you shockable.
That's right, you did.
And the delight, one of the many delights of Southwind, I've just been to Siren Land. I had a week there in Norman Douglas country. But one of the delights is that Douglas is unshockable, and this is the message he has.
Yes, exactly.
Life is so puny and blinkered if you're shockable.
Yes, well, it had the effect. It partly shocked me and delighted me. One of the books like Llewellyn Powys' Love and Death, which sort of opened up another dimension.
I don't think it means you've got to be uncritical.
No.
But unshockable, yes, but look at things realistically. And don't be afraid to look at them.
Well, I've concentrated on Sedbergh, but you obviously were happy and fulfilled at Daston School.
Oh, with a lot of anxiety and tensions and pressure, but yes, fulfilled. Oh yes. Oh, thank God,
And
yes.
you're glad you went.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Is there anything you wanted to say about that very long period? How many years were you there?
18, I think. 20.
Was it
20, jolly nearly 20. Yes.
co-educational?
We started as a small grammar school for boys only. We went co-educational 1 year at a time. But before that was completed, we went comprehensive. So we moved from being a school of 300 to a school of 1,200 in the course of about 4 or 5 years.
Wow, huge strain.
It was a wonderfully exciting time because once we'd done all the management business of creating the new school and getting the architect to do his stuff and getting the county to agree to what I and a colleague wanted, because we worked very closely together, the head of the modern school with whom we were amalgamating. Very close friends we were. And he became my deputy, they wanted to call him. I wouldn't have him as my deputy. I said he's got to be called associate headmaster. So I wasn't going to have him being demoted in the eyes of his own pupils. But where was I getting to? I've lost my train of thought. Where have we got to?
Well, we'll go back to this was when it became comprehensive.
Yes.
I mean, how the school changed when it became a
How
comprehensive.
the school changed. Yes, the exciting thing, I've got it now, after all the management and policy challenges, was that when all that was done and after we'd gone comprehensive and been comprehensive for about a year or so, I said, right, the thing's running. I can now get back into the classroom. And by that time, the structure I'd set up meant to say that the headmaster didn't decide who taught what. This was done by a man called the curriculum director.
Yes.
And do you know what the swine did? He put me into the classroom to teach all the lowest ability children he could find. And this was the most wonderful challenge for me. Because for the first time in my life, I had to face the problem of the techniques of teaching pupils. It was easy because you had pupils who were motivated, or if they weren't, they would be expelled. Now these pupils at Market Raisin, you had them. And you had to educate them, and you had to interest them. And the merit of being chucked back into the classroom at the age of 50, having to learn to teach for the first time in my life, was that a large number of young teachers were finding, as throughout the English educational system in the last 20, 30 years, finding enormous strain, tensions, problems, near nervous breakdowns, and 1 or 2 cases, actual breakdowns. And they would come almost weeping into one study and say, "Headmaster, what can I do about this problem?" Now, if I hadn't been back in the classroom myself, I wouldn't have been able to help them at all. I just had to say, get back into the classroom, boy, and get on with the job. And because of this practice, I was in the fortunate position of being able to say to such despairing colleagues, "Dear man, dear girl," whatever it was, you know, I had exactly the same problem myself in the classroom this morning. What are we going to do about it? Let's talk it through. And that was a totally novel experience for me.
Excellent. So then you retired. When did you retire from?
I retired from the headship of the Aston in '84, but I did a job with the county as a sort of advisory headmaster for a couple of years.
Yes. So to 86.
To 86, and then I did, I think, some self-employed work with the Boarding Schools Association, who wanted some research done. And this was quite interesting, going all around the country and interviewing heads and local authorities about boarding school policy. And then I gave it up.
But you didn't give up studying?
Oh, this was liberation.
Yes.
I could get into the archives,
Yes.
really for the first time in my life.
Yes. And then can you describe what you did in the archives? What your project then was, which links up with the
Well, when I said the desk is clear, I said I've got some family history notes. And I found the old box, which I had been putting bits of paper into ever since boyhood. And it took me 3 months to sort those papers out and to try and put the pieces together and to identify the areas of the jigsaw that didn't exist. And this gave me the chance to work out some sort of a schema and list of priorities, what to go for, and geographical planning came into it because one had to choose particular areas where the archives were, and planning expeditions to Ireland for the Irish ancestors was another part of the strategy, and getting into Wales, identifying old cousins who are still existing. That was another great fun. And I had a motorhome by this time, and Gillian and I just toured England, Wales and Ireland.
I wondered how you collected all that material. That's how you did it.
I used to go and camp in a caravan site or somebody's front garden outside a county town for weeks on end, and then drive into the city each day and do my archival stuff. Gillian, meanwhile, getting thoroughly bored. So she tended to stay at home after that, until we got round to the type of work which was both archival and visiting homes, because you've probably gathered from the photograph book you've seen, there's an awful lot of visiting places where ancestors lived and knocking on doors and being invited to come to dinner that night there and then, full of the most wonderful stories of fun and opening of horizons.
Yes. So how long did you work on this immense project, which is facing back how far? As far as you can go on the 4 sides, your wife's 2 parents and your own 2 parents.
And then 4 grandparents, and so, yes, so some lines stop after about 4 generations, and some go back 35 generations. Not quite to Troy, but to Ethelwolf and people of that sort.
Yeah. And how long did this take?
I must have started it in about 88, and I wrote the last words in summer of 99.
It took about 12, 11 years.
Yes. I suppose the writing took about 3-4 years, and the rest was all gathering material, sorting, sifting, digesting, reflecting.
It's on a word processor, is it? It's been printed out.
It's on a little machine called a star writer,
Oh, yes.
which has got disk capacity, and the whole thing exists on disk and on backup copies.
But how has it been printed out in the 6 or 8 copies?
From my own little star writer.
Has it?
Oh yes, which takes quite a time, but
I should think so. Yeah. It's a phenomenal work, and I'm very, very touched that you should be leaving a copy with me. The last couple of things I just wanted to round off with. One is that, when did you marry Gillian? Roughly.
Alan, if and when you manage to get to page 697 or whatever it is of the work, you will find that the last paragraph really gets onto the theme of the last 600 pages don't matter. That's all about roots.
Yes.
The real thing about life, as the opening sentence of the introduction says, is belonging. Home is more important than roots. And I then say I'm going to finish with a photo shot of where home was for me on August the 3rd, 1950, when Gillian and I married. And I then try to make a description of the social environment in which and cultural environment in which we found ourselves, and make the point that the comparable point that my grandchildren will find themselves in 100 years' time will be a matter for their choosing. We each make our own home of belonging. We each make our own cultural, social choice. Not entirely freely, but we are still able to choose. And yes, Gillian and I were married.
August the 3rd, so it's almost 50 years. To judge from my own relationship with Sarah, which has totally transformed my life, and she's been an immense support and encouragement and colleague and friend and so on. I just wondered whether you'd shared a lot of your work with or life with Gillian, or she had a separate...
I like to think I have, but you must ask her. She may not feel the same.
Well, at least if you feel that. And the other thing is, I'm tempted, I will certainly make a copy of this on a video cassette for you, and you may even get to play it at your family reunion, because I think your children might like to see it. They won't be able to have asked you all these questions about your life. So for that, and that in mind, is there anything finally you'd like to say to your children or grandchildren that could go on to this as well?
I think I've said all I want to about them in the magnum opus.
Yes.
Which might be an incentive for them to read it.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for
right.
a lovely interview.
Thank you.